Hi guys. Okay, so I have this book, English, Prose, and Poetry, and it is by John Matthews Manley, professor and head of the Department of English in the University of Chicago. This book is copyright 1916. It's very, very old, and it's got some great material in it. And I wanted to read an excerpt from Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy. And I thought this was a pretty good message, especially with today's modern world of technology and AI, artificial intelligence, amongst other machines, some of us are still raging against, pun intended. So I'm just going to read this again. It's from Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy. Faith in machinery is, I said, our besetting danger. Often in machinery, most absurdly disproportioned to the end, which this machinery, if it is to do any good at all, is to serve. But always in machinery, as if it had a value in and for itself. What is freedom but machinery? What is population but machinery? What is coal but machinery? What are railroads but machinery? What is wealth but machinery? What are even religious organizations but machinery? Now, almost every voice in England is accustomed to speak of these things as if they were precious ends in themselves, and therefore had some of the characters of perfection indisputably joined to them. I have before now noticed Mr. Roebuck's stock argument for proving the greatness and happiness of England as she is, and for quite stopping the mouths of all gainsayers. Mr. Roebuck is never weary of reiterating this argument of his, so I do not know why I should be weary of noticing it. May not every man in England say what he likes? Mr. Roebuck perpetually asks, and that he thinks is quite sufficient, and when every man may say what he likes, our aspirations ought to be satisfied. But the aspirations of culture, which is the study of perfection, are not satisfied unless what men say, when they may say what they like, is worth saying, has good in it, and more good than bad. In the same way, the Times, and that is in italics, Times being like the newspaper, replying to some foreign strictures on the dress, looks, and behavior of the English abroad, urges that the English ideal is that everyone should be free to do and to look just as he likes. But culture indefatigably tries not to make what each raw person may like the rule by which he fashions himself, but to draw ever nearer to a sense of what is indeed beautiful, graceful, and becoming, and to get the raw person to like that. And in the same way, with respect to railroads and coal, everyone must have observed the strange language current during the late discussions as to the possible failure of our supplies of coal. Our coal, thousands of people were saying, is the real basis of our national greatness. And if our coal runs short, there is an end of the greatness of England. But what is greatness? Culture makes us ask. Greatness is a spiritual condition worthy to excite love, interest, and admiration. And the outward proof of possessing greatness is that we excite love, interest, and admiration. If England were swallowed up by the sea tomorrow, Which of the two, 100 years hence, would most excite the love, interest, and admiration of mankind? Would most, therefore, show the evidences of having possessed greatness? The England of the last 20 years, or the England of Elizabeth, of a time of splendid spiritual effort, but when our coal and our industrial operations depending on coal were very little developed? Well then, what an unsound habit of mind it must be which makes us talk of things like coal or iron as constituting the greatness of England, and how salutary a friend is culture, bent on seeing things as they are, and thus dissipating delusions of this kind and fixing standards of perfections that are real. Wealth, again, that end to which our prodigious works for material advantage are directed. The commonest of commonplaces tells us how men are always apt to regard wealth as a precious end in itself, and certainly they have never been so apt thus to regard it as they are in England at the present time. Never did people believe anything more firmly than 9 Englishmen out of 10 at the present day believe that our greatness and welfare are proved by our being so very rich. Now, the use of culture is that it helps us, by means of its spiritual standard of perfection, to regard wealth as but machinery, and not only to say as a matter of words that we regard wealth as but machinery, but really to perceive and feel that it is so. If it were not for this purging effect wrought upon our minds by culture, the whole world, the future as well as the present, would inevitably belong to the Philistines. The people who believe most that our greatness and welfare are proved by our being very rich, and who most give their lives and thoughts to becoming rich, are just the very people whom we call Philistines. Culture says, consider these people, then, their way of life, their habits, their manners, the very tones of their voice. Look at them attentively. Observe the literature they read, the things which give them pleasure, the words which come forth out of their mouths, the thoughts which make the furniture of their minds. Would any amount of wealth be worth having with the condition that one was to become just like these people by having it? And thus culture begets a dissatisfaction which is of the highest possible value in stemming the common tide of men's thoughts in a wealthy and industrial community, and which saves the future, as one may hope, from being vulgarized, even if it cannot save the present. Says a mouthful right there. And Philistines is a term used to describe enemies of ideas and art. So that's like, there's Christ and the Antichrist. So it's the opposite. Now, were they a real nation of peoples back in the day? Probably. And they probably lived very lavishly, and industry and wealth were their highest attainments. So these modern day luxuries and conveniences that we are all able to use today can be used for beneficial reasons, but they can also, if the balance isn't kept, be to as humans, our detriment. So again, this was a reading from Culture and Anarchy by Matthew Arnold in the English Prose and Poetry by Manley. Have a great day.